Hello and welcome to the Project Doctor podcast. My name is Ralph Goossens and I'm your project management expert, presenting you with all the things you need to know about project management. Project Doctor is here to provide you with expert analysis and with recipes that you can put to practical use immediately after the podcast, so stay tuned. I'm very glad to hear that so many of you have already shown up, so let's get started right away. Here is episode 5 of the Project Doctor podcast. And we're going to do in this episode exactly what we're going to do in all of our podcasts, which is share project management expertise with you and provide you some recipes, stuff that you can put into practical use immediately. Today we're going to talk about constraints, hard boundaries. So have you ever felt like you're running into a wall in your project? Then keep listening, as we'll be sharing some insights about how to tell apart requirements from real constraints and the types and examples of some common constraints in many projects. Visit projectdoctor.online to download the extras that show you some key tools we'll be discussing in this episode. Now let's start with telling apart constraints from resources and requirements. In this style of the canvas that we are discussing in this series, we're focusing on fixed constraints or boundary conditions that are really outside the influence of your project. So let's first get some possible confusion out of the way. I'm not talking here about the triple constraint of time and scope and budget, or the quadruple constraint if you throw quality also into the mix. We will cover the triple constraint in another episode when we talk about the canvas tiles that are called resources, and of course it's also related to the tiles of planning and expectation management. But time and budget are actually resources for the project, just like the facilities that you're using or other stuff that can be influenced by the sponsor. These resources are more enablers of the project instead of constraints. They are the fuel, so to speak. And of course, as a project manager, you will always find that there's never enough fuel. So time and budget will feel like constraints, but in reality, they are limited supply resources. There's one simple question to keep resources apart from real constraints. And if you ask yourself the question about anything that feels like a constraint, does my project consume it? Then if yes, it is a resource, because constraints can never be consumed. If the answer is no, it's not a consumable, then it might be a real constraint or boundary condition, but we have one more question to ask. And the second question to tell apart real constraints from mere requirements goes like this. Is this self-imposed, or is it externally forced upon you? So, for example, an ISO standard for some quality aspect could be self-imposed. For instance, if it is part of the guidelines of the company, the architectural guidelines or whatever. Or it could be required by law. Only if it is required in an absolute way, then I consider it a real constraint or a boundary condition. And it's boundary conditions that really limit what you can do in and through your projects. These are the real constraints. So in summary, asking yourself 2 questions to find the real constraints in your project. The first one, can this be consumed by the project? If yes, then it's a resource, not a constraint. The second question, is it optional or self-chosen? If yes, then it's not a constraint, but it's rather a requirement. Boundary conditions can work their limitations on 2 levels. Inside your project, impacting how you can run it and what you can deliver, or outside the project, impacting the value that can be realized in terms of the goal of the project, which is something we've covered in the previous episode. Let's now consider some types of boundary conditions that you could run into in your project. The first type is physical limitations, limitations of space and place where to put or build or install whatever the project deliverable is. This is most noticeable in construction projects or any project where all or part of the deliverables is some kind of object, bigger or smaller. This type of boundary condition is less relevant if what you deliver is more of a service or if it is software, of course. A second type is language. And the people that you have to deal with in your project may not have a common language in a very, very literal way. You may have to make do with some lingua franca or language that you all share, but it is not the mother tongue of any of you in the team. In that situation can be very, very challenging, and your team members may have difficulty understanding the accent with which you speak your non-native language. Let me give an example from my practice. When working on one international project, one of the teams was located in Japan and the other was located in Southern Europe. And we had some serious difficulties in online sessions where both groups were involved. We used English as the common language, but for none of us, this was the first language. So some of us spoke with a heavy Spanish or Italian accent, or Dutch for that matter, and others with a heavy Japanese accent. So there were also problems of limited vocabulary, that is, not really knowing enough words in English to fully express what you want to say. Then it's very hard to get proper alignment and cooperation if half of what people are saying does not come across. Personally, I'm not sure what was worse, the times when I just didn't understand what was being said, or the times when I thought I understood, but I got it wrong. So what I learned is a major language gap is a serious constraint, and it translates into needing much more time for certain tasks. A second type of constraint is the culture gap. It's related to language, and some major language issues usually also come along with culture issues. This is also part of what we'll discuss under the context style of the canvas in another episode, but the culture element of a project's context can often also work as a constraint or a boundary condition. Culture gaps are more like pitfalls that are covered with branches and leaves. They're not noticed until you've fallen into one. And one noticeable aspect of that is habits and conventions that have to do with communication. So, as another practical example from the same project that I just mentioned, we also had severe communication issues due to the culture gap. The Japanese team, no doubt, found some of the messages sent to them way too direct and impolite, while some of the Europeans found several emails from their Japanese counterparts rather imprecise and vague. And this was especially the case when we were talking about deadlines and commitments. As I'd witnessed firsthand, the cultural conventions for discussing a planning and committing to it work very, very differently in Japan from Europe. Another common type of constraint is the legal one. And there are many types of local law or regulations that you should pay attention to in your project to double check whether or not they are applicable and how and what is applicable. For instance, you could think of labor law, which are often based on the ILO standards. For instance, regarding working hours or child labor or paying living wages or non-discrimination in the workplace. Another one is VAT rules. For instance, for international contractual arrangements outside your project, or it might be a hard requirement for example, financial software, if that's what you're building inside the project. There could be export regulations, which are a delivery constraint if you have to do with goods going across borders, for instance, in economic free zones. There could be building regulations, which obviously will be relevant if your project is in the construction sector. There will be OHS, or Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, which apply to the in-office safety for your teams. So that's something that you definitely will have to deal with. There might be applicable product or process safety regulations, for instance, in the chemical industry or in healthcare, again in construction, definitely in the food sector. If you're in software, you'll come across patent law or copyright law, and you have to think about the intellectual property rights of the software that you build and deliver. And there might be applicable economic law around fair competition or non-monopoly, or some rules about contracting procedure, especially in the public sector.
Oh, come on, man. Speed it up. This is boring.
One complex type of law that I want to bring to your attention is around data privacy. And there are many, many different variations. For instance, there is the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, applicable in the European Union. There is the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, obviously for California. There is the HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability, which is applicable in the US for healthcare projects. There is the APPI, the Act on Protection of Personal Information in Japan, the DCIA, Digital Charter Implementation Act in Canada, PDP, Privacy and Data Protection in India, or the LGPD, Law for the Protection of Personal Data in Brazil. That saved us some time, but definitely got you confused. But you can go to projectdoctor.online to download the checklist and see all of the details, read them at ease. And if all of that didn't get you started, then what is always applicable, of course, is the local criminal law. For instance, regulations about bribing or stealing, which usually is prohibited. So let's wrap it up. What have we learned in this podcast episode? First of all, we've learned how to tell the real constraints apart from what is actually limited resources, which can be consumed, and from requirements, which are self-imposed. Real constraints, on the other hand, are always external, and you can't escape them. And next, we've paid quite a lot of attention on a checklist of the various types of constraints, so that you have them at hand and can check how they might influence your project, so you are prepared for dealing with these limitations. Please visit projectdoctor.online to download the extra materials with this episode and all the others if you've not done so yet. And I thank you very much for your attention. Bye-bye.